This computer. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time it is, wherever you are. I am Aneesh de Vos, and we have yet another phenomenal guest. But the guest has been warned that, first of all, we have to invite the most illustrious and wonderful David Buckler. David, how are you doing?
I'm very well indeed, and hello to everyone out there.
Your fans will be glad. They will be glad. But enough of you, David. As I always say, you've had far too much of a build-up. So we are going to go to Professor t.oriordan, really amazing friend of mine, an incredible mentor, a little bit strict sometimes, but he is allowed to be, because he is not only a phenomenal academic, and he will berate me for saying it like this, but he is a phenomenal academic, and his life's work has been about looking at climate change and investigating it. He is also an author and quite the musician, involved in orchestras, playing multitude of instruments. But Tim, you are here today, aren't you, to talk to us about survival economics in relation to bettering the lives of people on the planet. David's done his reading up on you, but Tim, what does that mean, survival economics? Tell us a bit about it, please.
Economics has always been seen to be the lifeblood of growth, of improvement, of enhancement. The concept of economics has always been about the betterment of people, and by implication, all people. And so we've always assumed that economics will continue to provide that sense of, well, the only word I can use right now is betterment, making people overall better off, not only in terms of their material possessions and their education and their background and their understanding of the world, but also in terms of their spiritual and social values. And so economics has been a kind of mechanism for making human improvement forever. What we're beginning to find are three things which are really very challenging. The first one is that economics is not actually delivered for everyone equally or anything like that. In fact, it's actually gone quite the other way. It's persistently impoverished groups of people who are enlarging in number. It's also creating a kind of envy where people who can't get something feel they ought to get something. They're in the middle. They feel that they can get somewhere, they work hard or they try hard or even necessarily grab hard. But nevertheless, they think they can get up the pole if they work hard enough and utilize opportunity. Then you have people who are quote unquote at the top, i.e. have wealth, have education, have income, have status, have power, who often have this because of their birth or because of their connections or because of the way they've usurped other people's well-being and just taken it over. But nevertheless, are at the top because they've found ways of continuing to improve their economic advance and their material advance, and above all, their political and powerful control over the order of things. So you have increasingly three groups of people which are very different in number. Those who are dispossessed and getting less, which are more than 2/3 of the population. Those who feel they have a chance are given half a chance, but nevertheless are only making some progress and getting very frustrated and sometimes quite angry and disruptive. And those who sit at the top from the point of view of the economic pole, who are often at the top socially and politically, and they're the ones who feel that they can protect themselves against any form of incursion of the lowering of their wealth. That's been the kind of pattern in the 21st century. It's not new. We after all had slave labor back in 2,000 years ago, so it's not new at all, but it has a particular potency because of the degree to which we communicate with each other and the way in which people are more aware than they've ever been before of their place in the order of things. So it is about the idea that people are no longer prepared to tolerate something which was socially sanctioned for many, many millennia, but certainly no longer. And it's that which is beginning to show signs of wear and tear. That's the pattern. And what we need to ask ourselves is this actually a viable future for humanity? Or will it give rise to something which actually could threaten its long-term survival? It's not just a matter of whether we can keep these differences going, even though they're diminishing at the top and widening at the bottom. It's whether they actually are viable for the future of the human race as a whole, the way in which we're going about things. And that's the challenge. So the concept of survival economics is really the idea that we need a new form of economic assessment because it's threatening the totality of humanity over a period of time. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it could certainly happen within a measurable period of time, possibly 100 years, possibly more, at the rate at which things are changing. And that's the reason why we need to reassess what is the role of economics. It has always been about betterment, but it's about worsenment, the way it's currently operating, and that's just not tolerable for another 100 years.
Wow, that is, thank you. I think that's a really clear explanation. Certainly, I understand it in a much deeper way as well. And earlier, just before we came on, you alluded to talking about the loss and damage of those that are not responsible in different countries to how climate change has affected people. Can you just kind of draw in a little bit more on that, Tim? I realise we're pinging back to a conversation that we had before, but I noted it down because I thought, actually, I think that's really important because, climate change is here, isn't it? And, we are already knowing that different parts of the world are affected and indeed where we are is being affected. So can you allude a little bit to that, please?
We have a series of international meetings every year, which are known as the COP conferences. COP stands for Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Climate Change, which was passed by the United Nations back in 1992 and was formalized in 1994. And every year since then, there's been a conference of the parties to the Climate Change Convention. And that is being held in Abu Dhabi in 2 days' time. Starts on Thursday and is the 28th of those. Now, in that last year, having had a lot of discussion, which was a year ago, the Conference of the Parties looked at the whole idea of a loss and damage fund, which was that the people who were the big emitters, the long-term emitters of the two major greenhouse gases, they are obviously carbon by far, or carbon dioxide, which is 72% of all the emissions, and methane, which is another 20% of all the emissions, which is primarily from animals, but also from coal and decaying vegetable and woody matter. These two combined add up to what is known as global warming, the change in the nature of the temperature of the Earth because of the way in which they heat the planet and restrict the opportunity of the planet to cool naturally into the open space. That's been well known and it's been studied way back in the 1970s, but obviously become more significant since 1992 with the passage of the General Climate Convention, which took place then, and now become more formalized in a series of international meetings. What's happened is that over the period of time, it's become clear that most of the emissions are from a very small number of countries and a very small number of people. In fact, roughly speaking, 80% of all the emissions of carbon dioxide come from about 20% of the population, and about 80% of the world's population contribute virtually nothing to the carbon dioxide. And there are some countries, particularly in Central Africa, but many parts of the poor world, which virtually have no effect whatsoever if they're not damaging land by stripping trees or removing vegetation, which does create both carbon dioxide and burning, and also a lot of methane with animal use of the land when it's cleared away. But that's still a small part. So the main issue is the asymmetry, the imbalance between the people who are mostly carbon emitting, which are nations and individuals, and those who are suffering from the consequences of that, which is a climate change related phenomena. And they have no say in what's going on, and they're beginning to have major impacts. And the impacts are not significant, they're very significant. They are ones that your audience will know a lot about. They are obviously things to do with heat, which makes people very ill when it gets to a certain temperature, very ill and quite debilitated and unable to function. And it's probably the greatest threat of the lot because it's so ubiquitous. But once you get beyond 52 degrees C, people can't function at all.
No.
And if the temperature is that high with a high humidity, that is water in the atmosphere, water vapor, then the capacity for people to be outside in these conditions and do any meaningful work is extremely lowered indeed. So we now have many countries in the world, particularly in Africa and India, but especially in Southern Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and right through that group into southern China, where the heat is so great that people just simply can hardly get out, and they have got no air conditioning, no mechanism for saving. So we're talking about actually bringing people almost to the point of death, certainly debilitation, very serious. That's not yet universal, but nevertheless, it is the major cause of the climate change global heating phenomenon created by carbon dioxide, which acts like a blanket, holds heat in the earth, and doesn't allow it to escape as it used to do before we had this excessive burning of fossil fuels and other related carbon generating activity. But the other things are more familiar to readers because they are the things which from time to time affect groups of people. They are weather-related events such as tornadoes, such as floods, such as drought, such as just general disturbance, hurricanes of the atmosphere. But they are, relatively speaking, small in scale, even though they're large in number. But heat is a very different matter. It covers vast areas and large numbers of people, particularly in poor countries. And of course, the other side of the coin are things to do with the changing nature of the sea. The sea is not only absorbing a lot of this carbon dioxide and beginning to absorb other pollutants, and therefore it's warming. And when seas warm, you change dramatically the ocean biochemistry and also the ocean biology, particularly marine biology, and that means fish, but also all the food chains on which fish depend. So increasingly, the seas are becoming very stressed from the point of view of providing food for people. And then finally, we have sea level rise, which is well again known to your viewers, that when the seas start to increase in size, partly because you have what's called thermal expansion. If you heat water, it gets, in volume terms, larger. But also you have ice melt of various kinds, which add to the overall water concentrations of the planet. And sea level rise is beginning to have a noticeable effect on coastal communities where something like 25% of the world's people live, particularly again in poor countries.
Yeah.
So what this summarizes is says we're reaching a stage where we are beginning to see serious human health consequences on a scale which is unimaginable, both in terms of heat and in terms of threat at coastal level. And it is affecting the way in which we produce food, certainly from the sea, but also to a large extent from the land. So we're talking about the emergence of potentially a very significant crisis for the humanity of the world. And again, mentioning the evident point that most of the next generation of people will be coming from these poor areas. So the growth of the world's population, which is beginning to slow, is still substantially large in those areas which are most threatened by climate change. So that's the reason why survival is becoming an absolutely vital part of the human condition. Just keeping alive by one means or another is something which is much more significant than it's ever been before. Now, there are many other side effects of this. There's flooding, for example. There's drought. There's all kinds of things which afflict the way in which we grow food, where we live, the way we move. But the overall impact on this is a fundamental failure of the peoples who are not the cause of the emissions from methane and from carbon dioxide that is causing their damage. So the people who are most affected are the least generating the cause of their plight.
So it literally hurts my heart. I you know, you and I, Tim, speak, you know, at length about this, and it's just you know, it's horrible to hear it. It's horrible to hear it. I know it, but when I hear it each time, it feels like a real gut punch. I want to just lead you back to the loss and damage that you spoke of. That you said earlier, it's almost like a bit of an insurance thing, that there is an amount that people have to pay back. Am I right in that, or do you want to just guide me a little bit more?
No, loss and damage is something that's been on the agenda since the 1970s. It's basically, what are the costs to people in terms of cost to the economy, and what is the damage caused by climate change in relation to goods and services, infrastructure, and so on. After all, floods and hurricanes and storms damage property, and they damage roads, and they damage telecommunications and all of that kind of thing. So loss and damage has been something which for a long time has been an argument of almost moral force, which is that we're not the ones that are causing what is causing us so much grief. We're not creating greenhouse gas emissions. We're not undertaking these things in any scale. And yet we are the ones who are suffering from the consequences. And you, i.e. the big emitters, should be paying up in a kind of insurance policy. You know, you're causing us loss. The losses are not caused by us. We're innocent parties. You should pay off. So loss and damage is a means of generating funds from the wealthy big emitters and paying from these funds for reparation, i.e. damage caused by climate change related events, and also for adaptation, helping people to adjust so that when climate change takes place, they can cope with it, which means protecting against the sea, protecting against heat, protecting against fire, all the things which climate change generates. So that's the package. Now you're going to ask, and I think I'll just anticipate this, what is the cost of these things, and what are these costs adding up to?
Yeah.
Well, there is no yet. Well, first of all, there's no overall figure that people can talk about, but certainly the figure that's bandied around is $5 trillion equivalent. Now that sounds a lot, but the global gross domestic product, everything produced by people, is the order of 70 trillion. So it's still small. Well, that's everything in the whole planet. That's what human beings create in goods and services. But that's still, so that so-called 3 trillion or 5 trillion sounds small, but two things have to be borne in mind. One is that this is a figure only in what is called measurable impact. So it is disease, it's damage to roads, it's damage to infrastructure, it's stopping getting access to fishing. You know, there are millions and one things that are caused by these climate change related effects, which are measurable because they have economic or clearly defined social effects. Yeah. What they don't tell you is what is the underlying breakdown of society. They don't tell how long it will take for society to recover from significant damage. It doesn't show anything about what the next generation may experience if we carry on like we're doing, which could be 10 times as great as what's right now, or even 100 times as great as what's right now, because we have no idea of how these so-called tipping points, these larger escalations of climate-related effects, especially on a very broken and vulnerable people, can actually have almost overwhelming consequences, which we cannot begin to estimate, but could be within the lifetime of people being born today, very easily within the lifetime of people being born today. And this is what's changed the dynamic. What's changed the dynamic is that the modeling, which is much better than it's ever been before, and the evidence from the modeling, which is much more profound and much more ubiquitous, it's all over the planet. We're now modeling changes in sea conditions, changing atmospheric conditions, changing in terrestrial conditions all over the planet, because we now have that technology, which wasn't around 10 years ago. So what we're beginning to realize that there is actually a set of damages or undermining of people's well-being and livelihoods, which are way beyond these measurable, relatively high-profile phenomena, such as the loss of a road caused by storms in the sea, or by changing the infrastructure, say, of shipping ports and the like. So it is completely different order of magnitude when we start putting all this together. And that's what's given rise to this need that we ought to have a special fund which pays the reparation for those who have been unfairly affected by all of this because they've not been the cause of the emissions, but they're the recipients of all the damage, and they can see trouble on a large scale coming down their way from which they have no escape unless they migrate. And that gives rise to another dimension, which I think we delay for a little while because it confuses the listener if we get too far into this too quickly. But in a nutshell, for both of you, we've finally reached a stage where the scale of this, though it looks quite small, 5 trillion is big by any standards, but it's still small by the global GDP, gross domestic product. It is actually far more serious than we realize. A, it's escalating rapidly. And B, for some countries, it's reached a stage where they cannot have economic growth at all. They're merely marking time just to keep ticking over. So they've lost the capacity to improve the conditions of their people for all the things which are fundamental: health, education, social status, social justice. The things which are fundamental to the human condition are being removed from them because there's just no means of getting that to happen. That's the bit that we're beginning to cotton on to. This is really now a moral question as much as it is an economic question or a social question.
Yeah. David, I want to draw you in because I just want to flick over to you, David, on the back of what Tim is saying. You know, we are therapists, you know, we are well versed in trauma. And I'm just hearing here that lack of psychosocial integration that can occur when you break down a community. And so I would just like to draw you, I saw you nod like yes. I'd just like to draw you in on that and see if you can, you know, just bring Tim in as well. And you know, let's go a little bit further into this.
Yeah, what we do, and we've noticed more recently, is we find ourselves up against psychosocial situations, put people in so much need that it seems that psychologically that's almost an afterthought. What you're dealing with is stress at such a high level because of people trying to survive. So you have to break through that before you can make any sense of what's supposed to happen in a counselling practice. So I think many of us are realizing that you can't you can't give any attention to one without the other. And so what I'm saying, I guess, in a nutshell, is counselling and psychotherapy has to take into consideration the political climate and the climate as a whole, and it has to be addressed.
And I think there's something around there that Tim, you know, you've acknowledged about actually this becomes about morality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking, you know, morality, huge subject, one that we don't have time for today, but morality is also indicative of the culture that you live in as well. So, you know, if we look at a Western neoliberal capitalist society, it's about productivity, isn't it? And I'm just wondering about that kind of, it almost feels quite jagged if that is what a Western civilization is saying, and that they are one of the biggest emitters without a doubt, and then that is falling on to other communities, and they're no longer able, as you said, Tim, to be productive because, you know, they've not got social justice, they've not got jobs, etc. I'm just wondering, are we not then still in that same old position of West and what we give, we choose?
Yeah.
Tim, you know, I get a bit pissy about the West.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the situation that I face and the things that Tim has described, is the level of distress. If you can scale distress, you can't in forms of trauma. But what you're talking about in terms of the countries that Tim's mentioned and what they're facing, I mean, it's difficult to get your head around the scale of the distress that's caused.
Absolutely.
I think there is something which is beginning to get more recognized, both of you, David and Aneesh, and that is the scale to which anxiety
Mm,
is becoming more widespread
Mhm.
and also deeper. Now, anxiety is your special area, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to define it or anything, but one thing that becomes very clear is if you have some kind of upswelling of anxiety caused
yeah,
by all kinds of things in your life or in your family's life or whatever, then an anxiety caused by what we use as word existential, that is
yeah,
beyond our
Yeah.
control and potentially threatening our even existence. That's what existential means.
yeah,
It therefore comes to the point where people become anxious beyond anything they can cope with because they feel they're no longer able to manage the situation in which they find themselves. Now, I think there are two angles to this for both of you, which is what I'm trying to get across in this economics of survival.
yeah,
Angle number one is that we have to change the economic model if
yeah,
we're going to have any kind of capacity for many countries and many peoples in these countries. We're talking about 2/3 of the world's population to have a meaningful existence, which is the word existential, a meaningful existence in, say, 50 years' time, not very long, and well within the lifetime of people who are teenagers today. But the other side of this for both of you is that that level of anxiety is producing almost like an immobility, a feeling that I'm incapable.
yeah,
Nobody is able to help me with this. I'm incapable of coping with this.
Mhm.
I'm just feeling crushed
Mhm.
by the very chance, the very thought that I'm no longer got any kind of agency or under my own power to
mm,
improve my condition. That sense of not just helplessness, but complete annihilation of the persona of someone who might otherwise have some hope that they can improve how they live, how they relate to people, how they feel about themselves. Now, I don't think we've begun, this is where you two come in and your listeners come in and your viewers. I don't think we've begun to realize this is a profound social, psychological,
Mhm.
moral question.
mm,
And so the economics of survival, for me, I call it survival economics, is not just about making sure that we have a viable economic future.
no,
It's also about we have a viable personal and social future and a moral future. Now, if we don't get these things into our minds soon, then the loss of any sense of capability of hope becomes a fundamental existential threat. That, to me, is what is beginning to emerge, but we haven't got the evidence of that, anything like the scale. Where you come in and where your wonderful listeners and viewers come in is that this is actually something where I think the therapist has a profoundly important role to play. But you also need people like myself, not a trained therapist, to help you show that there are ways in which we can move toward hope. And this is
mm,
one of the parts of our discussion and why I call it survival economics. It's a different economics. It's an economics that accepts the fact we can't grow forever. It's
yeah,
an economic effect that we cannot just simply allow some people to survive and become ascendant, other people to fall and become descendant. It is actually an economics of survival and of human repatriation of the human condition in the context of a living planet. It's a hugely important therapeutic issue for me. So that's why I'm very delighted to be on this call with you two.
Mhm.
I-
It's
you
so well
go,
explained,
David.
Tim. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So well explained. I mean,
In regards to how we address it, I mean, I did look at
yeah,
some of your previous work, which I found fascinating. And I was drawn to particular paper on sustainable development. And before that, the precautionary principle, and so much of that information, that those principles come into play in what you've just been saying there, as, if you like, what might have been done and what hasn't been done and where that leaves us.
Well, what might have been done, David, is really that we're perfectly honest, we've just lost the plot. We've been warned about this since the middle of the 19th century. I am associated with an outfit called the Tyndall Centre, for Climate Change, which is based at the University of East Anglia. John Tyndall was a 19th century chemist, and he warned that certain gases were warming the atmosphere. And through him and many other atmospheric scientists, they showed that there was likely to be a warming of the planet caused by the emissions of carbon dioxide, methane in particular, and also nitrogen-related gases. Now, but bear in mind that the Earth, there's a small side issue here. The Earth is warmed to the overall temperature of 15 degrees C because of water vapor. We have a tiny amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, a natural greenhouse gas. And frankly, without it, we would be on a snowball Earth. We'd be in an Earth which is basically ice and we wouldn't exist. So water vapor, greenhouse gas, at its basic natural phenomenon, is part of what we call the life-creating and supporting forces of planet Earth. But what we've done is taken gases from the atmosphere, from the Earth, i.e., in this case, fossil-related gases, and pumped them into the atmosphere in a very short space of time. And it took millions of years to lose these gases in the Earth. There's a lot of argument as to what all this is about. I'm not going to get into that from the point of view of Earth, because a lot of this is essentially slightly fanciful. It's not scientifically well grounded. But the fact of the matter is that we've sat on this growth of well-known Earth heating since about 1920. And certainly since 1970, it's become scientifically provable.
Yeah.
So the question that you're asking is, why have we done nothing? And the answer to that question is very simple, actually. It is because we're in the grip of forces which make it their business that we do nothing. They are forces associated with the fossil fuel industry, they're forces associated with finance, and they're forces associated with the military, and they're forces associated with power. There's no question that what dominates our society feeds on a greenhouse gas economy. And that's why it's almost impossible to foresee the removal of greenhouse gases on a scale which will take us to what's known as net zero, i.e. effectively no new heating caused by unnatural gases in the atmosphere. That is a goal of all nations. It's frankly, it's like an aspiration. It's not going to be met, but it's nevertheless due to be met by year 2050. And this is what these conferences of the parties are all about. They're trying to move this dial in favor of getting that goal out. Let's not get too far into the conference of the parties and the one coming up in a couple of days' time, because it'll be guaranteed to be a failure on all fronts. But what is important for this discussion is it will at least address much more in detail than ever before this issue of loss and damage. And it will try to set up a loss and damage fund. Now, I'm in danger of going into too much detail, which I don't think is what our conversation is about. But summarizing, by the time we get to the end of this conference, it'll be 12th of December, roughly 2 weeks from now, there will be a very small commitment to a fund that should be very large. We're talking about the cost of climate change in relation to the planet Earth of at least $1 trillion US a year, possibly $3 trillion US per year. I gave you a figure earlier, some people think it's as much as 5. The most that the wealthy nations will come up with will be a number of hundreds of billions, but they won't actually deliver it, they'll just promise it. They've already promised another fund around adaptation and removing greenhouse gases from poor countries. But that's, again, still underfunded. It's meant to be 200 billion, and it's no more than about 170 billion now. And even then, the money's not all coming. And we're in countries which are going through economic crises, and there's a growing political dissent about climate change amongst many wealthy countries. But I'm trying to avoid that conversation because it has, A, it's well known amongst your readers and viewers, and secondly, it's actually not what I'm after. I'm after the fact that we're beginning to realize that this is so powerful, so significant for the well-being of the humanity and of all living matter on the planet, and that the planet has 4,000 million years behind it to get to this stage. Now, the planet will actually survive. If we all disappear in the next 200 years, in 1,000,002 years, planet Earth would be as rich as it's ever been. So it's got absolutely no care about what's going on. But the fallout will be at the very poorest and increasingly a larger number of people. So the question for me is, we need a survival economics actually to allow us not only to survive as human beings, but actually to change ourselves as sentient people in a sentient planet, to be much more able to live with each other in comradeship and in support for each other. This is the heart of therapy. So I think that the line you guys are taking in terms of therapy for those who are suffering for a variety of reasons, many of which are not their cause, caused by them, and helping them go through difficult times because of that, is in fact now a global phenomenon for everyone. It's not just for those who for one reason or other have been afflicted by their past. That makes survival economics a completely different animal from economics. Economics has always promised lollipops and never delivered. Now we're talking about promising fundamental therapeutic change to let everyone feel they're believed in and they can do something worthwhile about themselves and each other, and that they live as sentient human beings in a sentient planet, and are so grateful for the fact that we have this opportunity to restore our life on the planet forever in the way in which it should actually be lived in a what I call a coherent and caring way. That's the essence of survival economics. And that's the reason why it's about survival of powerful values. It's not about just survival of economic assets.
You know what, Tim? We always say it, but literally we could carry on listening to you and learning from you. Like I say, I have the huge pleasure in being a friend of yours, and I listen and learn from you on many occasions. And every time I hear something new, I just want to say thank you for coming in today. Thank you for sharing this information. I think I am now a complete believer in survival economics. And I'm just going to say to anybody watching this, listen to this again. You will find more information. I can bet you that you'll find more information. Share this with people. Let's get this message out there, not in a we know better or anything like that, but the only way that we can really start working together is actually start working together and, you know, not separating ourselves. These are scary times. Let's not pretend that they're not. They are. We're therapists. We're affected by these things just as much as everybody else. We haven't got the answer in terms any better than anybody else. But I think it is a time for cohesion and for recognition of how different people live in different ways, and how we can, when I'm in therapy with people, I always say, don't do it like this, okay? When you're working with yourself, don't hit yourself. Come alongside yourself. Come alongside yourself. Start listening to yourself. So it's the same thing. Start listening to each other. I feel a bit preachy, and I don't mean to be, but I just think this is really important. And it just shows how something like economics can really come alongside the therapy world in how we're looking at this with each other. I'm going to say thank you, Tim, for coming, but I'm going to hand it over to David, as I always do, to close us today, David. And Tim, you're just bloody fabulous.
Yes, indeed, Tim. Thank you so much. I would need a while just to inwardly digest that, and thank you very much for your company. It's been absolutely fascinating. Maybe I should leave with just a few words from a paper you're involved in, the precautionary principle, which has a lovely line in it, or one of the principles was making the polluter pay. I think that's a lot of what you were just talking about in one way or another. We appreciate your company. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, everyone, for being with us. Thanks again.
Well, it's been a delight to talk to you both. I feel there's something is beginning to happen which is actually momentous. And that you do an enormous amount to help people who realize that their lives are difficult, but you manage to help them reach a point where their lives are worth living, and it is something not just for them, but for their offspring as well. That's what we're after. Remember that all of this is not for us, it's for who follows us.
Yes.
If we can't get this right, who will follow us will suffer from conditions which are avoidable, very easily avoidable, not easily, but they're avoidable. But if we do nothing about it, there is a moral loss of capacity for us to be deserving of what we're giving to the next generation, who are our offspring in a variety of ways. So therapy is about connecting to generations to come and recognizing we have a responsibility for being part of that. And you do a wonderful job in the therapy world for enabling that to happen. Every person who's upgraded by your therapy is a better citizen for whoever that comes after them. That's part of what we're talking about.
Thank you, Tim. And viewers, share this with your bloody MPs. We'll go.